Regular listeners of this show know that I don't often talk about my personal history or my path to journalism very much on this program. But for the next segment that we're going to do, I felt like I should share with listeners part of my history with the people that we're going to be talking to and with the movement that they are a part of. And it deals with the Catholic worker and the Plowshares movement. So by way of a little bit of personal background, I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. My father and mother are both from Illinois. My dad grew up on the south side of Chicago in Hyde Park. His parents were Irish immigrants who came by boat to the United States in the early 1900s, and he grew up in a pretty traditional Irish Catholic family. And as he came of age and was contemplating what he wanted to do with his life, one of the things he was considering was entering the priesthood. And at this time in the 1960s, when my dad was finishing high school and looking into college, you had the rise of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King and the marching throughout the South and the anti-segregation movement. And then eventually Martin Luther King brought the civil rights movement north.
Dr. King, how are things shaping up now for tomorrow?
Things are shaping up beautifully. We have people coming in from all...
And it settled in the city of Chicago. And my dad became very politicized during that era. And having grown up as an Irish Catholic, the aspect of the broader social justice movement that really spoke to him was the evolution of something that became known as the Catholic left. As I was thinking about this segment, I thought it makes sense to just give my dad a call.
Hello.
Hey, Dad.
Hi.
My dad had gone to see Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic worker movement, which is an anarchist pacifist movement.
I actually met Dorothy Day in Chicago, and that's kind of where I learned about the Catholic worker. I was always attracted to the values and the belief system because, I was, very much within a framework of Catholic social action, so to speak, in that era.
Hearing Dorothy Day speak completely changed the course of my father's life. He decided that he wanted to work among the poor, and he began doing tutoring and housing projects in Chicago, but felt like that wasn't enough. And eventually he decided to leave home, to leave his immigrant parents, and to do something that actually they objected to. He took a bus to New York City, and he moved in to the Catholic Worker House.
So I went to the Catholic Worker around late September 1969. I was 21 years old, just graduated from college. There was a soup line every morning. The soup line doors would open at 10, and the line extended from the door of 36 East First Street all the way around almost, there was a gas station on the corner of 2nd Avenue. And it lasted for about an hour, and it was quite a big production. And that was a big deal, and that lasted for a couple hours, and then there was lunch, and then there was some cleanup chores, and there was the clothing room. And so it was very, direct, hands-on type of things that were done there at the time.
Dorothy Day asked him if he would be willing to go down to Cuba as part of what was called the Venceremos Brigades. Fidel Castro was still developing the Cuban Revolution. And so all of these young people from around the world were invited to Cuba. And my dad was sent by Dorothy Day of the Catholic Worker Movement to go on a delegation down there and to cut sugarcane and to write about his experiences.
Dorothy said, I can't, for lots of reasons, I can't find anybody to go. And she said, I want to send you there. And I said, oh my God, I know nothing about this. I was a real novice with leftist politics and still learning. And she said, no, you can do it. And she said, just write what you see and write what you think and write what you feel has happened there. And you have my full endorsement to go.
My dad actually met Fidel Castro when he came to their camp one evening, and Fidel addressed the international workers who were there helping with the harvest of 10 million tons. And when my dad returned to New York, he wrote an article for the Catholic Worker newspaper that was called
Up from Nonviolence, a Young Catholic Worker in Cuba. I really felt that there was some validity to this revolution. And basically in the article, I said, I defend the right of the Cuban people to defend themselves. And the phrase they used was La Lucha Armada, the armed struggle. I began to see that in a different light and understand that a little better.
I knew that my dad had some connection to some Catholic newspaper or Catholic organization, but it's my dad. I wasn't really that interested in hearing about it when I was little. And when I was going through my own searching in life and deciding what I wanted to do, I had dropped out of university in Wisconsin, and I essentially hitchhiked to Washington, D.C. in the mid-1990s and moved in as a worker to the nation's largest homeless shelter, which was called the Community for Creative Nonviolence. And it was the summer of 1995, and it was the 50th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the entire peace movement descended on D.C. for the entire month leading up to the anniversaries of the atomic bombings. And there were all of these incredible people there, people like Daniel Ellsberg, the whistleblower of the Pentagon Papers, Philip and Daniel Berrigan, radical priests who had really jump-started the Catholic left with their actions aimed at burning and destroying draft cards that were being used to send primarily poor people to fight in the war in Vietnam. And this really was the height of Catholic faith-based activism. No one had seen priests take these kinds of actions.
We regret very much, I think all of us, the inconvenience and even the suffering that we brought to these clerks here.
We sincerely hope we didn't injure anyone.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.
We have chosen to be powerless criminals in a time of criminal power.
One of the days during that summer of 1995 where there were all these protests at different sites around Washington, D.C., there was a big demonstration at the Pentagon, and I had just gotten to know Phil Berrigan and Liz McAllister. And Liz McAllister came up to me at this demonstration and she said, would you escort Daniel Berrigan? He has to go to the bathroom. So Dan Berrigan, and this was pre-9/11, Dan Berrigan, a very slight Jesuit priest, and I was blown away that was the first time I met Dan Berrigan. We walk into the Pentagon and go and find a bathroom. And I'm standing there at a bank of urinals next to Father Daniel Berrigan. And he says to me, it's surreal. We're inside the Pentagon. And he says to me, when Roosevelt signed off on building the Pentagon, he had always promised that after it was done, he was going to turn it into a hospital. And Dan Berrigan said, and he actually kept his word. It's the largest insane asylum in the world. And so that's how I met Daniel Berrigan. And meeting Liz McAllister, Philip and Daniel Berrigan was absolutely life-changing for me. I don't know that I ever would have become a journalist if I wasn't subjected to those kinds of people whose entire lives were about the pursuit of justice and living according to their beliefs. And, Dan Berrigan was also a fan of saying, don't just say something, stand there. And that's how I think of all of these people, that they're people that are willing to stand there when it's necessary. I'm bringing all of this up because the history of the Catholic worker movement and the history of what would become known as the Plowshares movement represent a largely untold narrative of actual resistance to some of the gravest threats that the imperial nation of the United States represents to the rest of the world through nuclear weapons. And both Daniel and Philip Berrigan lived a life where they were in and out of prison. Phil, in particular, spent about 1/10 of his life in prison for anti-war actions.
If the war makers would stop making the bombs and would go into disarmament, we'd go back to working with the poor because we come from that tradition.
And in 1980, once again, the Berrigan brothers united with like-minded individuals and they started a new movement called the Plowshares movement. And the idea was quoting from the scripture of Isaiah, that they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and nations shall not take up arms against other nations, and they shall study war no more. And they went into the General Electric factory in the King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, with hammers and their own blood. And they physically hammered on Mark 12A nuclear warheads. And they destroyed equipment, and they poured their own blood on documents and computer systems. And they were arrested and stood trial. And that action that became known as the Plowshares 8 would, similar to the draft board raids, spark a movement of people that began to do symbolic acts of resistance against nuclear weapons systems. And last April, on April 4th, 2018, it was the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. A group of 7 activists, including Phil Berrigan's wife, Liz McAllister, people from the Catholic Worker Movement, a current Jesuit priest named Steve Kelly, divided into 3 teams and snuck onto the Kings Bay Naval Submarine Base in Georgia. They had to cut their way through fences, navigate the base, and they poured blood on structures inside of the base. They unfurled banners against nuclear weapons, and they brought with them an indictment of President Trump and other U.S. officials for their continuing involvement in the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the threat that is always present to use them. These nonviolent activists, these 7 people, were eventually arrested by the U.S. military and interrogated, ultimately handed over to civilian authorities, and they have been charged with multiple felonies. They are facing up to 25 years in prison for their actions. I know every single one of these 7 people. I lived with Carmen Trotta. I lived with Liz McAllister. I lived with Father Steve Kelly during my time at the Catholic Worker in New York, as well as at Jonah House. These are some of the best people that I've ever met. People who have spent their entire lives living in voluntary poverty among the poor, in servitude to the poor, and also confronting the machinery of war.